everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob. It's me, Diana Perry Cruz. Hello.
And, oh, no, Jackie's not here. Well, she'll be on the way. She had some technical difficulties, so she'll be jumping in a little bit later. But we were very fortunate because we can't do a podcast without 3 people. So we decided that we wanted to have a special extra guest. And luckily, he just happened to be the guest that had articles we wanted to talk about that he'd written. We really luck out sometimes
really.
on the serendipitous. Really luck out sometimes on the show. So we are joined today also by Dr. Matt Tincani. Did I say it right, Matt?
You did. Yes, you did.
Before we started the show, Matt was reminding us how to say his name because apparently when we talked about some of his other articles, we have said it wrong. So we'll be getting it right for the remainder of the show. But now I'm in my head about it, Matt. So there's a chance I will say it.
Yeah, it's a really weird, but I'll just say in your defense, it's a very uncommon last name. And the way I pronounce it is not the correct Italian pronunciation, so it's totally forgivable. And I don't.
Okay. That's the nice thing about names is you can really do it however you like.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, and I do.
I mean, Rob's last name is Cruz, but it's spelled just alphabet soup
it's not
so
spelled
no one
ever
gets it right. So we're with you. It's okay.
Yeah.
I don't know, Matt. I think it would be an awesome joke. Well, I don't think it would be now because we're talking. But wouldn't it have been an awesome joke to be like, "Yeah, I'd love to be on your podcast just to tell you I got my name wrong. Peace out, suckers."
Well, I thought about doing that, but then I just thought that would be not cool. So
no,
we really appreciate.
Honestly, it was pretty hilarious.
Sorry
we would have released it as a bonus episode of ABA Inside Track served, And here's Jackie, fresh off of technical difficulties.
I'm so sorry.
That's all right. Well, we're just getting started. So, Jackie, I guess you're the guest now because Matt is the third host. We replaced you while you were gone.
That's fine. I had mild child. So I had to deal with some crying children, which I didn't think you all wanted to deal with.
Not really.
That's not why you're listening.
It's not a child care episode. But let's you know what? Let's get into what we're talking about. So it's about a lot of things: practical jokes, special guests, but mostly this podcast is about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. And every week we pick a topic and discuss it at length. And this week, because Matt is with us and he has recently published some really cool articles on the subject, we're going to be talking about identifying questionable research practices, or QURPs. Matt, is that what you call them? I was looking at my notes and I saw like QRP, IRP, and I was like, QURPs and ERPs. I feel like that's the name of the episode now.
I like that. I mean, we say QRP and IRP, but QURPs and ERPs, that might be. I'm gonna think about that.
Okay,
maybe start using those. Turn them into acronyms.
I don't know. They said they rhyme, so you never know. But feel free to use it.
Okay,
it's a gift.
Thank you.
But so we're going to be talking about how to identify those practices and hopefully how research can continue to improve. I'm very excited to talk about this topic, Matt, because I am not a researcher, the same as I know you are and Diana and Jackie are, but I certainly consume a ton of research for practice, a ton of research for discussion on the podcast. And so the idea that anything I could be reading and then I'm telling everyone like gospel from the mountain, look at these results. It's a single subject design. Those are impossible to do wrong. The idea that one could do them wrong, I'm not that gullible, but that someone could be using research practices in a way that is not necessarily for like evil purposes, but there's ways that the results are a little hackable. That definitely is scary because I think a lot of folks, when they read an article, they say, well, I saw it in a peer-reviewed research article, ergo, this is true. And knowing that isn't necessarily the case for a number of reasons, which we'll talk about, I think it's great that you are bringing that more to light and not just making it something that the randomized controlled studies sort of always get in trouble for this, that it actually is something that could be occurring to us in our single subject design world.
Right.
But I'd love to hear kind of just a little bit for our listeners, a little bit about yourself, and then a little bit about how this became something that you wanted to devote so much energy to having full day micro conferences about.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So thanks for having me on. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this work, which I think it's important. we're hopeful that it's going to have impact, but we're still early on in the process of disseminating it. So this is really a multi-year project. I think we're now in year 4 of this project. And the paper that you read it's the first of what we hope will be at least a few papers on the topic. And I'll talk about kind of like the next stages in a couple minutes. But I got into the field like when I was in college. I started working I took a course called behavior modification, which was really a course in applied behavior analysis, and it was taught by a behavior analyst. And we learned about basic principles of behavior, and the professor for the course, he was a guy named Phil Duncan, said, hey, if you're interested, if you think that this stuff is cool, there's an opportunity to like actually apply this stuff with kids that have this thing called autism, which I had never heard of, and most people hadn't heard of back in 1993. And there was a family close to me in the Philadelphia area that was implementing an early intensive behavioral intervention program. At that time, we called it low-VOS therapy. And the family, in fact, was getting support from the UCLA Young Autism Project to do this ABA. And they were doing, they were doing it like a lot of it on their own. And, I was trained as a low-VOS therapist and to apply these kind of principles of behavior to try to help this young boy. And I thought it was really cool, and I decided that I was going to make a career of it in some way. I graduated and I worked full time. There was no BCBA then, of course, as you know. So I worked as I worked initially, the first year out of college, I worked in an institution, basically. I was a what we call now a direct service provider, but I was sort of working in this kind of private residential institution with a group of mostly young men with some pretty significant challenges. And then I worked as a behavior analyst, that was my job title, did that for a few years. I got my master's degree at Temple University while I was doing that. And then I went on to enroll at Ohio State to get my PhD in special ed in ABA. Spent 6 years out in Las Vegas. I worked at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas as kind of a faculty member in both special education and ABA. And then I went back to Temple in 2008. And that's kind of where I've been since. And so you asked how I became interested in this topic. Well, when I was a graduate student at Ohio State, as I did my dissertation looking at comparing 2 different modes of augmentative and alternative communication, the picture exchange communication system and sign language. And then I got a job as an assistant professor, and I wanted to publish that. So I put together a manuscript, and there were initially 4 participants in the manuscript that I submitted. And there were 2 participants for whom the sign language and PECS strategies had been to some extent successful. And then there were 2 participants for whom neither strategy was particularly successful. So I submitted all 4. And then the editor of the journal, who was a really great, fantastic, supportive editor, and I got a lot of really good feedback on the manuscript. But they said, and I can't remember whether this was partially a function of the reviewers' feedback, but they said, well, you really have 2 studies here. So I think let's just keep the study, or sort of break this down into the study with the 2 participants for whom this, PECS had worked for one more so, and sign language had worked for the other more so. Let's just keep these 2 in this manuscript. And then, these other 2 for whom the interventions didn't work so well, that's a different manuscript, that's a different manuscript, and maybe work on that and submit that later or something like that. So ultimately, my dissertation study was published, but with only 2 participants, and probably a reason for that was probably because the data just weren't great for the 2 participants who didn't respond very well. So I started thinking about this issue then. Of course, I was really early in my career, and I was assistant professor, and there was a lot of pressure for me to publish. So I was just I said to myself, well, okay, it's fine. I'm going to, I'll put these other two participants together in a different manuscript, but then I just kind of moved into different projects and I just moved away from it, and that was never published. Well, or the data from those two were never published, but I think subsequently the manuscript ended up getting a fairly significant amount of attention, because at that time there was kind of a debate going on between which is a better augmentative communication system? Is it PEX? Is it sign language? And you kind of had sort of one prominent person in the field saying it's PEX, and another prominent person who's doing all these workshops and things saying no, PEX is not good, it's sign language. And the discussion was, my paper was part of that discussion, but I think the nature of the discussion might have been different if the four participants had been it rather than just the two participants. So this nagged me over the years. And as I developed as a researcher and I started following kind of the whole literature on the replication crisis, and I started reading some things that had been written about it, sort of not directly addressing it in the single case experimental design literature or ABA literature, not addressing it directly, but addressing some issues that were sort of tangential to it. I started thinking well, this is something we should be paying more attention to. So probably, this is maybe 5 to 7 years ago with my colleague, Jason Travers, we wrote a couple papers. We wrote one paper where we argued that studies that don't demonstrate experimental control should be published. Well, really, we wrote two papers along those lines. One was published in the journal Remedial and Special Education, and the other one was published in Perspectives on Behavior Science. So then maybe this was 4 or 5 years ago, I think Tim Slocum, who is a faculty member, a professor at Utah State University, and his colleague, Ronnie Dietrich, who's passed away, but Ronnie was at the Wing Institute at Morningside Academy. They approached me and Jason and our colleague Art Dowdy, and they said, we want to kind of look into this issue. We want to look at questionable research practices. And Tim also kind of came up with this concept of improved research practices. And so he's really, even though I was the first author on this paper, this whole project was really a manifestation of his vision. And so we started sort of working through this big research project, and the paper that you read is the first part of it. So,
oof. Wow. So, Matt, sometimes we ask that question and it's I just really was interested in this, but wow, that's just like a topic that has been dogging you in some way or another, nagging at you your whole career pretty much. Wow. This must be a very cathartic topic at this point to be able to kind of talk about and reflect on.
Yeah. To a large extent, yes. It's good. It's definitely good to write about these issues and research them, and also kind of relate it to a personal perspective. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we've got 2 articles, our main article, and then kind of one that's a little bit more for background. But Diana, please tell us what we'll be discussing today.
Oh, sure. So we have been provided with 2 articles that will inform our discussion today, and they include Extensions of Open Science for Applied Behavior Analysis, Pre-Registration for Single-Case Experimental Designs by Tincani, Gilroy, and Dowdy, and that was published in JAVA in the year 2024. Also, and more directly, Questionable and Improved Research Practices in Single-Case Experimental Design, Initial Investigation and Findings by Tincani, Travers, Dowdy, Slocum, and Dietrich. And that was in Perspectives on Behavioral Science, probably recently, 2025. I found it.
2025. Well, it was right around my birthday that it was accepted, huh?
It was your birthday present, Rob.
Oh, I didn't even know I wanted it.
You didn't know it at the time.
You know what?
Happy
the best
birthday
presents
to you.
are the ones that you didn't know you actually wanted, but then you're excited that you got them. So
if that's the best birthday present you got, you're not doing that well.
So, Matt, you we were talking a little bit about the QRPs, the corps, the questionable research practices. Would you mind just kind of going over what are generally thought of as the questionable research practices that one is should be aware of in designing and implementing research?
Yeah. So the idea of questionable research practices originated in the group experimental design research literature, and most of the discussion and research around QRPs has really been focused on the group design research literature, and researchers tend to trace the origins of the problem to a paper that was published by Rosenthal in 1979 about the file drawer problem.
Yeah.
And Rosenthal said the file drawer problem occurs when researchers conduct a study. They fail to get some statistically significant finding, or they fail to get the effect that they're looking for. And then they toss the paper into the file drawer, and it ultimately doesn't get published. And then the resulting literature is biased in the sense that studies with, statistically significant effects, more robust effects, are overrepresented in the literature. And so the file drawer problem or selective reporting, it's one questionable research practice. So if we fast forward to or QRP or Corp. You're going to get me saying Corp now. It's very sticky.
That's my day present.
Yeah. So we fast forward to 2015. The Open Science Collaboration was a group of, it's a very large group of scientists, and I don't know the size off the top of my head, but they attempted to replicate the findings of 100 studies that were published in 3 prominent psychology journals. And they found that on average, the replication study attempts yielded only half the mean effect size of the original studies. They also asked expert raters to evaluate whether replication study effects were consistent with the original study results. And they reported that only 39% of replication study effects were consistent with the original study.
Not good numbers.
So that's So that's indicative of something going on. But it's important to note that it could be a function of the file drawer problem as a QRP, but there are also other QRPs that could potentially be in the mix. For example, researchers might conduct statistical tests on their data in ways that make experimental effects look, more robust. There might be ways of sort of tweaking tests, or they might conduct several different tests and then just report the ones that yield more significant effects, and that's kind of referred to as p-hacking. But that's QRPs in the group design literature.
Yeah, Matt. How do you feel about the journals that have tried to come out by publishing the null results or the bad results? There's been a few times in our field where people are like, I'm going to make a journal just for all the things that didn't work. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, a journal. Yeah. So I'm familiar with journals that just publish negative results, but I don't know those journals very well.
Same.
I know what some journal editors have done is they've had, and there's a, I don't know that it's a behavioral journal, but it's a journal that publishes single case recently had, I'm completely blanking on it, but they had a special issue just on null results. And I think that's definitely a move in the right direction. And we could, spend some time talking about this, but I think just in terms of editorial policies, but I think that if journal editors developed editorial policies where they explicitly solicited all kinds of manuscripts, but including ones where the studies don't demonstrate robust experimental control, and they gave guidelines to authors about those kinds of studies, I think that would really help kind of propel us in the right direction as a field towards seeing more of these studies appear in the literature. Because when you submit a journal article for publication, you're kind of, I don't want to say you're at the mercy of, but you're sort of like, it's sort of up to the reviewers. And if the reviewers aren't aware of these issues or they don't have guidance, then reviewers might tend to reject those studies because they might tend to view experimental control as synonymous with study quality, which is an issue that's somewhat unique to single case experimental design, because historically in behavior analysis, applied behavior analysis studies, a experimental control is regarded as an essential feature of an experiment. That's how in early on in basic research studies, Skinner and Sidman, that's how we discovered and elucidated principles of behavior, was through establishing experimental control. So it's if a study doesn't have experimental control, it's not a good study. We've made the argument that so, for example, if you've otherwise done a really good, really rigorous study like you have arranged for, good demonstration of experimental effect. You've got really high treatment fidelity. You've operationalized your dependent variables really well, and you have a really suitable measurement system for your behavior, and your study has all the features of a good study, and you implement an intervention and it's not effective. That probably speaks to some boundaries of that intervention rather than it's a bad experiment. So I think the message that we're trying to get out there with this work is that there are some cases where if a study doesn't demonstrate experimental effect, that it's a good study. Probably it's just that it highlights that maybe the intervention, some parameters of the intervention weren't working well. It could, maybe the dosage wasn't enough. Maybe it wasn't being implemented with the way it was supposed to be implemented with fidelity. Maybe it's not appropriate given the intervention. The people who were implementing it weren't able to implement it well. So maybe it's an issue with the intervention agents, or maybe it's an issue with the individuals, or they have some characteristics that make this not work as well for them. I think that's why it's important for these studies to kind of get out there, maybe more than they are.
Mm. So Matt, you mentioned sort of, we've got a lot of issues going on when it comes to when it comes to publishing. We've got our file drawer problems. We've got in at least more group design. We've got our the p-hacking. I mean, you can mess around with statistics until you get the results that say, aha, there's significance if we run this test this way or with this data set. Beyond just the idea of experimental control, not experimental control, good study versus just good study with results that just happen to not work out the way that things were expected. But again, I was really surprised when I was reading your articles. Questionable research practices almost always feel like they're either just the study was just bad, which could happen to anybody, or that's a group design thing. But you even mentioned in kind of your own how you came to this topic that we can still have questionable research practices in single case designs. You had the example of the editor, or somehow in the feedback process of let's just focus on the two participants with good results. So that would certainly be one way you could kind of change your results a little bit without meaning to. What are some other kind of questionable research practices that would be more of a problem for, say, single case experimental designs than, say, group?
Sure. Yeah, totally. I can give you some examples. And first, I would just like to talk a little bit about kind of like what are QRPs? Like just sort of a kind of like a definition, because it's important to distinguish between QRPs and research misconduct. Because QRPs it's not research misconduct, although interestingly, sometimes in the literature, they're sort of treated synonymously. But research misconduct involves really serious violations of research integrity, like conducting research without obtaining informed consent, or unnecessarily putting your participants at risk, where the risk to benefit ratio is just is really off, or even like fabricating data. And we've heard. We've heard, there are certainly classic examples of this, like the Tuskegee experiment comes to mind, or there have been some there's a researcher at Harvard University who actually her name is Francesca Gino. I think I'm saying her name correctly. But she actually just lost her tenure at Harvard, essentially fired from Harvard for fabricating data, or she's alleged to have fabricated data. So but that's not. What's that?
Right, and she was studying honesty. Her years of research.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of. Yeah, it's really, what is it called? It's projection. I think that's what psychoanalysts call that. There's definitely some complicated verbal behavior going on there, where it's like, I'm doing this and then I'm writing about it. Yeah. So with QRPs, when you're conducting a study as a researcher, you have a lot of choices to make. If you're conducting a single case study, your choices include things like, what kind of observation and measurement system am I going to use? What kind of design am I going to implement? How many sessions is my baseline going to be? How many sessions is my intervention going to be? What are going to be my decision rules for changing from one condition to the next, or from baseline to intervention, or from intervention A to intervention B? And the same things apply in group studies, but they kind of map on differently. But like in any study, there's lots of decisions that you have to make. And we could call those degrees of freedom, right? So QRPs are given those degrees of freedom, QRPs are researcher choices that inject bias into a research study and the research literature more generally, but they're practices that can be acceptable under some circumstances, but they become problematic when they inject bias. And like any behavior, they're behaviors that are subject to or under the control of contingencies of reinforcement, right? And those things might be like I was explaining to you earlier, it's like, well, I am going up for tenure and I need to get published, so I need this publication. Or, I think in some cases, like, if a researcher has invested in a particular intervention or a particular strategy, they've invested their, professional resources or their financial resources on the line. There's grant funding on the line. Well, it kind of behooves you to publish, and so there are contingencies there. So some examples in single case. So let's say I'm doing a study, and I'm not citing FCT here because, like, I think that functional communication training is particularly prone to QRPs, or that they've been done in FCT. It's kind of an arbitrary example, but okay. If I'm doing a study where I'm evaluating the effect of FCT on challenging behavior, and I implement extra procedures to enhance the apparent effects of FCT. So let's say that before I implement the FCT, I do some rapport building with the participant. Like I do some stimulus pairing. Like I hang out with the participant. I present them with things, stimuli known to be reinforcers for them. And then I do my FCT, and FCT works. And when I write my research report, I describe the FCT, but I don't describe those, whatever warm-up procedures or rapport building procedures, then people are going to read the report and they're going to attribute the positive effects or the benefits to the FCT, but really the total picture is missing. And it wasn't just the FCT; it was these other things. Because the researchers, maybe they really wanted FCT to work, but they know that there need to be these other elements in play. Or let's say, like, I'm doing different research study and I'm evaluating some intervention. Maybe it's like a communication intervention, and I selectively recruit participants because single case studies, they usually don't have that many participants, maybe 3, maybe 5. And I selectively recruit participants into the intervention condition or into the study that are more likely to respond, because maybe they haven't received this particular intervention before, but they've received a similar one in the past. Or maybe they received it like in the distant past, and I know maybe they're going to be more likely to respond. And I don't report that. I don't report that I did that. Mm-hmm. Right. Or let's say I've got one participant in my study, and I've got them in baseline, and the baseline data are really variable. I don't really have a stable baseline, and then I drop in the intervention, and the intervention data are similarly unstable, and there's really not much of an effect. And I say, well, I'm just going to drop that participant from my study, and you don't report this. So I just want to make the point that transparency is key in all of this. None of these decisions per se are bad or are inherently like bad decisions, I would say. They're problematic because, as I'm describing them, the researcher's not reporting that they did them. Like so transparency is what's really important. Like if you're reporting that you're doing these things and it's in the research report, then people can judge that and can evaluate that. But they become QRPs when they're done and they're not reported, right? Mm-hmm. So those are just some kind of hypothetical examples. And if you read our paper, the questionable improved research practices paper,
2025 one.
Yeah, the 2025 one, and you look through table 2, you'll see lots of different examples that are single case specific. There are good examples
in there.
Oh yeah, we'll get into those.
I feel like this is a little bit like if you have like a really great spaghetti sauce recipe, right? And someone's like, "What's in your sauce?" You're like, "Oh, it's so easy. It's just tomatoes, olive oil, garlic, salt," right? Mm-hmm. And you're like, "So easy. You just cook it up." But what you don't tell people is that what the amounts are that you've put in to your ingredients, right? Or that you cook it for 6 hours and then, oh yeah, don't forget you also add like a little splash of red wine, right? Like all of those are important components, but they maybe don't get listed as like the main ingredients. And they are actually critical to turning out the product that everyone likes.
I think that's a really good analogy. I definitely like that analogy. Or maybe you even have, some ingredients that are just like that you're just not talking about.
Secret 13 secret spices, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Hey everybody, sorry to pause the episode, but we will be right back talking with Dr. Tincani about questionable research practices right after this quick break. We'll be right back.
Hi, do you want to be a BCBA, also known as a board certified behavior analyst?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Massachusetts to get your graduate degree, just minutes outside of Boston.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education, dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years.
And our 2022 graduates had a 92% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy approved fieldwork placements, ethics mini handbooks, PhD levels professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland if interested.
And don't forget, our program is accredited by the Association of Behavior Analysis International, or ABAI, as a Tier 1 master's degree program.
Don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu.
regiscollege.edu.
One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there.
Bye.
And we are back talking all about identifying questionable research practices with Dr. Matt Tincani. But before we continue on with our interview, we would like to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved, and by listening, you're able to earn 1 CE. All you need to do is finish listening to the episode, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, or you can click the link in your podcast player. Then when you're there, enter in some key information, including 2 secret code words. And these are special guest code words. The first one is dachshund. And that is, it's not, you can't spell that one phonetically. It's DACHSHUND. It's like a little wiener dog.
Yes, we will also accept wiener dog.
Dinah says she'll accept wiener dog. And since she usually looks at that, you could write either one of them in. Just in case you were wondering.
For 10 years, yes.
But
did
not,
anyone?
but not wiener.
No, if you just
dog.
don't send us. Yeah, that's no good. And if you were wondering if I spelled that word correctly without looking it up, you would be right. I did first time. Thank you very much. Dachshund. All right, back to the episode. So, Matt, I know the previous article before the 2025 publication was sort of going into the idea of like the general open science practices. Mm-hmm. And like you said, it really just felt like you could read that. And here's a list of transparent practices. And you sort of talk a lot about the idea of pre-registration, which to me sounded like, I mean, I'm not thinking as deeply about this as you certainly are and have been, but just the idea of what if I wrote down the sort of thought process behind my process and I put it somewhere everyone could see it, not so much that it's, and now I can never change it, but just here's what baseline will look like. And if I changed it, here's why. Here's how I might get rid of a data set. And here's why. So you should go into the thought process behind it. It's up there for everyone to see. You can make whatever changes you want to. As you mentioned in that article, it's not meant to be like a box of like, I changed one thing, but I didn't write it. So I guess I'm a bad person. No one will ever trust me again. Right. You can change it, but it allows everyone to be very clear about here's what you said you were going to do and why. And if anything is different than that, you also have to explain your process there. So just everything's out in the open. That kind of feels to me like that might solve a lot of the problems, but clearly it didn't seem like it was going to do everything it needed to do, because you then went on and did, your kind of the micro conferences, your survey, you're continuing to work on the project. What is it about the current practices that just didn't feel like they were, I don't want to say enough, but maybe that is it actually. It just wasn't enough to sort of really make sure that we put a damper on as many QRPs as possible.
Yeah. So it's a really great point. It's a great question. It's an important issue. So open science practices, like you were describing pre-registration. So with pre-registration, you essentially publicly archive or register your research plan in a place where other people can see it prior to conducting the study, so that after you conduct the study and maybe write it up and publish it in a journal article, people can compare your pre-registered study to what you ultimately did and published, just to verify that you didn't do anything kind of post hoc or after the fact that deviated from your plan that you didn't report. And it's just one way of promoting transparency, and it's one way of sort of providing information to your audience that you did a rigorous study and you followed your plan. The point that we try to make in the QRP IRP paper, at least we try to make, is that while pre-registration is beneficial in preventing QRPs, it's probably not sufficient to prevent all the QRPs that could possibly be out there or be done by researchers. So, and there's several reasons for that. So one is, although pre-registration is adopted in many different scientific fields, informal surveys that we've done tell us that there aren't that many single case researchers doing pre-registrations, even though it's something that we're trying to promote and encourage people to do. Generally, if you're looking at a research study that's published and it's been pre-registered, it'll say that our authors will say that, so that folks can go look at the pre-registration. And it's not just the uptake in single case has not been that great to this point. So the kind of our analysis of improved research practices is sort of it provides an alternative way that we can address some of these things, but not directly through pre-registration. And then pre-registration is very useful, but practices like pre-registration can't necessarily prevent every QRP. So researchers could omit key information about a study from a pre-registration, just as they could from a research paper. You could omit information or whatever. So we approached our project from a behavioral perspective. So first, let's attempt to operationalize the problem. So what are QRPs? What are the topography of these behaviors in single case research? And then let's try to identify specific alternative behaviors, or IRPs, or pairs of QRPs and IRPs to address them. So this was definitely Tim Slocum's idea, and it was really a brilliant one. How would a behavior analyst approach this? Well, we want to try to identify the topographies of the challenging behavior, if you will, and then let's try to identify alternative behaviors to occasion and reinforce.
I think that leads perfectly to the kind of the follow-up study, which I think we'd read another article, or I think we have an article coming up where something similar occurred in special education, where groups of teachers came together and did little conferences. But I can't think of too many in behavior analysis that took this format. So just for folks who haven't had a chance to read the article yet, you had...
Okay, so you mean the way we did it, we basically the kind of qualitative method that we did?
Well, I've certainly seen qualitative analysis of research, and that seems to be much more popular. It's gaining a lot of steam, and we really like that format. But it's just the idea, because usually when you think about a survey, you're we sent out a survey to 1,000 people, and everyone wrote their thoughts. This was we don't know who responded. This seemed like a very targeted. You found experts in the field across a number of disciplines, and they'd come together for these day-long micro conferences to talk about QRPs. And then for every QRP, it's like a little game. The rule is come up with an IRP. So what would be the improved practice? And then let's just do this until we're
saturated.
Saturated. I was going to say the less scientific term is I'm tired of looking at these results. They're starting to say the same thing over and over again.
Right.
But what was the thought process? So Tim came up with the idea. I'd love to hear more about kind of the thought process behind that, how it was developed, what it kind of looked like and felt like to be doing this, because it is a really cool idea for a research study.
Yeah. So there's we looked at similar efforts in other fields where they attempted to identify some type of research standards. And kind of the loose term for a process like this is a Delphi process. And that's not specifically linked to trying to come up with research standards, but it's if you're trying to identify, issues amongst a group of people, and you understand that the best way to do that is to talk to people and try to generate some type of consensus, like the sort of the Delphi approach. We sort of like loosely implemented a Delphi approach. But so first issue is like when other scholars, mostly outside of behavior analysis and single case, have written about questionable research practices, they've kind of, I don't want to say made them up, but I think like they've come up with like there's one survey that was done, and I can't give you the citation off the top of my head, but where basically like the authors just kind of made up like some QRPs and asked some researchers like, well, do you do these things? And kind of gave them a survey that way.
Right.
Given that this all is very new in single case, like we didn't feel like we could come up with some examples of what we think were our QRPs are ourselves. And in fact, I've done that I did that in a previous book chapter, but we weren't confident enough that we could come up with an exhaustive list without talking with people. And like the only way, so then we were like, well, then we need to talk with people to come up with just some like preliminary list of QRPs and IRPs. And so that's how we came to doing the micro conferences. And so, in qualitative research, you typically you're interviewing a person like, one-on-one, and you're asking them questions, and then you're transcribing their responses, and then you're trying to organize their responses into themes. But since we wanted to try to get the sort of points of view of as many single case researchers as we possibly could get. And then we thought, well, how could we, doing like a typical qualitative study, like how, I've never seen a qualitative study where they like interviewed 68 people or what, I forget how many people we had exactly, 68 or 64 people individually. So like, how could we possibly do this? And then we kind of came to the idea, it was probably Tim's idea, like, well, we'll do micro conferences. Like, so we'll sort of divide them up into groups, and we'll get them together in Zoom, and we'll ask them questions. And so we went through each section of a research manuscript, and we asked them, well, can you come up with examples of QRPs that might apply to the introduction of a research study? Ones that might apply to the procedure section, ones that might apply to the variable and measurement section. And we sort of sequentially went through the sections of a manuscript like that. But then we asked them, once I identified QRPs, we also asked them to identify IRPs. And there's a better name for it. Like there's a general name for it, but the app we use, it's actually Google discontinued it. It's called Jamboard.
Yeah.
But you basically have like a shared, kind of like note, I don't know, whiteboard or whatever. And then people kind of virtually post notes to it. Mm-hmm. So that was good because then we didn't even have to do like the transcription. We just uploaded their notes we just put them in an Excel file, and then we were able to analyze them and then kind of cluster, identify, QRPs and IRPs that were mentioned frequently, and then categorize them together and under sort of, different themes. And that's how we were able to, after a long year of analysis, that's how we were able to come to our list.
And you can and those are linked in the article too. You can go in and actually look at the copies of the Jamboard, which is cool.
Right.
But Canva does a really good replacement for that, because I used to use Jamboard all the time as well. And Canva is basically modeled. They have pre-set up ones that are modeled on Jamboard. So if anyone else needs a replacement,
everybody loves Canva. It's like the hot thing.
It is hot.
You can make all your pamphlets.
So hot,
right? It does many things. My wife's a special ed teacher. She teaches online, and she's all about the Canva.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I had to do some playground rules, and I use Canva AI to make pictures of I need kids to be doing this in a picture, and the stock ones were all terrible. And I'm like, no, I need them to look like this, or I need this many kids, or I need them to be this.
You want all kids to have all fingers.
I need every kid to have a terrifying face, or whatever AI does with our fingers everywhere.
Oh, it's so amazing! Wow, our world's changing so fast.
This is true.
End of that story. The kids were so scared of the pictures, they never broke the rules again. No, it's all.
So did you initially think that the micro conferences would be 6 hours? Or were you at first we can knock this out?
Yeah,
No?
we planned. We planned for that.
Wow.
Yeah, so
That would have been exactly what opposite of what I did. Like, well, it's gonna be like 45 minutes, and then
I know,
6
right?
hours later, we're like,
Specifically
Well,
chose
here a long
participants
time.
that you knew could talk for 6 hours long each, and you're like, I know we'll get everything we need.
yeah, we're all very we had a very sort of fleshed out, very very well defined agenda. It's like we're going to talk 30 minutes about this, and then 30 minutes about this. Kind of starting with an overview, and then kind of getting into the sort of purpose of what we're doing, and then I read through a script basically, going through each of the jam boards, but it wasn't boring because it was like we had so many. It was an opportunity to spend a lot, like hours, like picking the brains of like the smartest people. And so, well, it was like a nerd fest, but it was like, we tried to recruit researchers at different kind of stages of their sort of career trajectory. And there are a lot of really, really bright kind of early career kind of researchers who are doing a lot of really cool work in single case experimental design. Many of them are working in ABA, but they're not all working in ABA. They're working in school psychology, or they're working in special ed, or they're working in, or they're, research methodologists, and they're interested in like statistical techniques. And we also had some really super prominent people in the group as well, so it's kind of nerve-wracking a little bit, it's like got to make sure everything, but we planned it really super well. And, Tim was a good leader, and it's, it was great. It was time well spent.
I did want to ask Matt, because you mentioned at one point that some of the topics that didn't end up in the final sort of table of QRPs and IRP pairs, some of them were related to like, well, this wasn't really, this isn't related to QRPs quite the same way. It's more about like publication bias and some other things. But you did use the term, which means I want to ask about it, that there were some controversial topics that came up around single case experimental design.
Okay,
I want to know.
Get it, yeah.
I'm assuming they were like nerdy controversial as opposed to some hot take on
no, it wasn't
SEDs.
anything. There wasn't anything like salacious. I think that we probably didn't word that. I think our meaning didn't come across well in the paper. So our point there was that if someone brought something up that was not controversial in the sense that it was like, oh my God, someone like, there are these people that take their clothes off, like, and they're like, there wasn't anything like that. It was more like, so for example, I don't know, yeah, it's a nerd. This is like definitely like a nerd's way, like a single case nerd's way of looking at it. But randomization is something like using randomization in single case experimental designs is something that's controversial in the sense that there isn't like consensus about that. So anything that people suggested that there wasn't a consensus that it's something that we should be doing as a field. There's a consensus that we should be reporting all of the things that we're doing in our procedures in a study. Like that's understood, that's something that we should be doing. Like we should be depicting our data in ways that are, accurate and reflective of the individual's like behavior and performance. But like those are not controversial things, but some things are a little bit more controversial, at least in the single case design world. So those are the things that we were talking about. In addition to things like, so some people made suggestions that were good suggestions in terms of single case research, but they weren't necessarily things that related directly to QRPs. Mm-hmm. Like, so, for example, a suggestion might be something like, well, we need to conduct more research in naturalistic settings. Okay, that's a great suggestion, but conducting research in a non-naturalistic setting is not a QRP. Mm-hmm. Like there's lots of studies where efficacy studies where an intervention is implemented in kind of a more controlled environment, like a lab or a clinic or whatever. And those studies are good. Those studies have value. Those aren't QRPs. Like when researchers are doing those kinds of studies, we might say that as a field, we need not only those studies, but studies that are in more naturalistic settings, but not a QRP. And also we also admitted things that were just maybe like more general in kind of nature. But no, there weren't any things that were controversial in the sense that I think you were, maybe you were thinking, or even things that were very surprising. Like there weren't a lot of things that were super surprising. I think the main thing that was surprising, at least to me, was actually the number that we came up with. We came up with 64, which
it's like one per participant, so everyone earned their keep there.
Right.
No. People, they contribute. There was, the people contributed more than lots.
Yeah.
But one could get the impression, I'm glad we're talking about this, because one could get the impression it's like, well, in single case, like, because in the group design world, like they generally, like, there's one paper by these researchers, I want to say they're in the Netherlands, where they just identified like a ton of like QRPs in medical research. It's a great paper, and it's cited in the 25 paper. Because I read that paper and I was like, oh my God, I've never even thought of that. But we came up with, like, generally in most of the QRP papers, they maybe talk about 10 at most. And we came up with 64. Wow. And one of the reasons we came up with so many is because we really, in much of the QRP literature, they tend to focus on QRPs that happen in the data interpretation and reporting process. And they don't tend to focus more on like the more study procedural QRPs or things that happen before or while the data are being collected. So we just really carefully prompted the participants to give us every possible QRP that they could think of at the different stages of the research process. And even at the very end, we said, is there anything that we missed? Are there any QRPs that we missed? So that's, I think, part of the reason why we came up with 64. Another reason, I think, maybe I feel kind of more tenuous about this, but lots of decisions that are made in single case design experiments, we have a response guided approach where we might keep a phase going or not based upon how the participant is responding, or we might change an intervention or something like that. And maybe we have more degrees of freedom, and that maybe could set the occasion for more QRPs. But I recall making that point to a reviewer, and a reviewer kind of like disagreeing with it a little bit. And so I feel somewhat tenuous about that, but maybe that's another reason.
Yeah.
Why we came up with so many.
Yeah, but we're certainly not going to go through all 64. That would not be fun to listen to. But folks, definitely.
I wish you had prepared them as a song.
Number 2.
There's a great table in the article that has the QRPs on one side, the IRPs that were sort of generated on the other side. It goes through the 6 categories that were sort of identified, which is mostly like the 5 main areas of a research paper. I think there was one that you said it was just like 1 or 2. I think there might have been only one QRP that I think was this maybe study level. I think that it didn't sort of fit anywhere else, so it kind of became the miscellaneous category of one. But I would like to, Matt, ask you if there were any QRP IRP pairs that like jumped out at you, either because they felt like, yes, this is what I've been talking about, like everyone understands this topic like I do, or that you were just like surprised, like I never thought of that. I can't believe, wow, what a great idea.
I don't think that there were any that particularly surprised me, but the QRPs related to selective data analysis and reporting were the most interesting to me, because I suspect that those are occurring maybe more frequently than some of the other QRPs. And I think I've also observed some of them, like when I've reviewed papers, for example. So, for example, I've seen like papers where they've scaled the y-axis on the graph in a way that appeared to enhance the they did in a certain way, a certain scaling. Maybe they scaled. You don't see this very much anymore, but maybe like 5-10 years ago, I used to more frequently see papers where they would scale the y-axis, same behavior, same intervention, but they would scale a little bit differently for different participants because the participants responded differently. I think they wanted to show more effect, but kind of tweaking the y-axis. Or the authors, they do a visual analysis, like they present the data and then they're just like, the intervention worked, but they don't really explain their approach to visual analysis. Or the same thing can be done now with statistics. Like, so a lot of behavior analysts or a lot of single case researchers now are doing, statistics with their single case data, but they sort of like say, well, this is a statistic, this is the test that we did, and here are the results, but they don't really provide a rationale for why they did it. And there's many different tests that are available. It's like, why did you select this one? Like, how did this particular test meet the assumptions of your data and that type of thing? So those are pretty interesting to me, because I think those are things that I've seen a little bit more more frequently, whereas I think some of the other ones are maybe a little bit more, probably somewhat more infrequent, or at least they're harder to observe because unless you've like some of the QRPs that are related to some of the procedural things that I was talking about earlier, like if you did selectively recruited participants who were more likely to respond to an intervention, those are things like you couldn't really tell from reading a manuscript. You'd have to would have happened, or they're doing some sort of like procedures to make an intervention more effective, but like you couldn't tell that from reading a manuscript. You'd have to be a part of the study.
Yeah. And this is in the paper, but we kind of skipped over, but researchers aren't doing this maliciously as well.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So I love the Venn diagram that you had at the beginning where it was like almost overlapping circles of publishing data so that it is, contributing toward the scientific literature and helping clients, and then publishing data so that it also helps sort of propel your career forward. And they're almost overlapping, but there could be like a tiny little sliver on the side where things get into the gray area. And you make a really important point that there are several competing contingencies in place for getting your research published. And it's tough out there.
It is.
Mm-hmm. I know that it can be a really grinding, long process to get those papers finally to publication. And a lot of decisions have to be made along the way. For example, we have a paper that's finally accepted, but it has...
Congrats.
Three very straightforward data sets, and then one very messy data set that we did a lot of different things that were required, and we kind of had to start and stop, and eventually something worked. But it's not, if you looked at it, you weren't like, that's a beautiful graph. That shows experimental control.
So you just cut that one out. You're like, this looks bad. Let's get that one out of there.
Well, I'm curious. Right? Did the reviewers express concern about that? Do you think that caused a challenge in the acceptance process? That one graph, that one participant, that one panel that just where there was not great experimental control?
It was something that we had to have discussions on how we were going to best display the data, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's a lengthy section in the discussion talking about it, where I think I referenced the Rosenthal file drawer effect, actually.
Oh, okay. Good.
Because I was like, this is in here for a reason. I want people to see what it can look like when it's not perfect, because it's not always perfect, right?
And it wasn't.
But there are also other types of, pressures on researchers who are trying to publish data, one of which is space, too. So you don't always have the luxury of spending a page of your discussion talking about the ins and outs of like the less than perfect data set. Sometimes you might only get to publish it if you truncate your manuscript. And
right.
And then if that would have been the data set, they would have had to have gone if that had been the decision of the reviewers. So it was very complicated. Yeah.
Well, that's great though that the reviewers and the journal editor, the associate editor, journal editor, saw the value in including that participant where things were a little bit messy, because experiments often happen that way. And then also kudos to you for putting that manuscript out there. And it sounds like you explained it and explained what happened and what you did and the data and contextualized it. And that's all, those are the important things that we need to do. So,
So,
and then publishing. I love a Venn diagram though. Just say.
The Venn diagram.
Yeah. Well, feel free to cite it. Feel free to cite the paper the next time you have a study like that, and say, "Listen, this is what Tincani, these guys said that this is good."
So, Matt, let's move into the next section of the show, the dissemination station, where we kind of talk a little bit, we sum up, and we sort of talk about what's next. Because I know you said this is a multi-year process. It's not like, and we did it, folks. We did the conferences, and never talk about this again.
Here we go. Here we are answering. We're here.
So, Matt, I'm curious, what would you say are some of the barriers still in play? Because you have a great list, 64 items in a table. It's very clear. Here's what the possible problem could be. Here's what you could do instead. We've got the open sciences kind of work already. Yet, like you mentioned, it's not like everyone is sort of beating down the door to like, I got to start. I'm going to put every single one of these into play tomorrow. What do you see as sort of the reasons that it probably won't be as simple as, look at the table, everybody, and then everyone just, oh my goodness, I can't believe it. I'm going to change my ways.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would say just awareness is one thing, which is, why we're putting this work out there. But I'm glad that the papers came to your attention, and really glad for this opportunity to talk about them to an audience. But I think it's just a lot of it's just related to awareness. Like, I'm not sure that all single case researchers are even aware of the concept of QRPs. But at the end of the day, as with all behavior, it comes down to contingencies. So if journal reviewers aren't looking for QRPs or IRPs in manuscripts or providing feedback about them, then behavior is not going to change. That's why when you were asking about, you're telling me about your manuscript, I was like, well, I'm really curious. Like, what did the reviewers say about this? The same thing goes for journal associate editors and journal editors. But on the other hand, if journals develop guidelines around QRPs and IRPs, and organizations develop guidelines and standards about them, then that researchers could refer to or reviewers could refer to, then that could create the context for behavior change. Like, so, and there's other examples from this, from the field of single case. Like, so there's like the What Works Clearinghouse guidelines on single case design, which are somewhat controversial, but that's an example. Those are an example of some guidelines that have been, sort of developed and supported by the U.S. Department of Education. But they're out there, and folks are paying attention to them and attempting to follow them. But like in the mid 2000s, the Council for Exceptional Children, the kind of major special ed, research policy organization, kind of facilitated this process where researchers in various design traditions wrote papers on like what are best practices in descriptive research and in group experimental research and in single case experimental design. And so there was a paper that was on kind of quality indicators of single case research. That paper, those standards were written. The paper was Horner and oh gosh, I'm totally having like a brain, like the thought, the author were Horner and Mark Woolery and a few other folks. And those have been very, very influential, but they've been influential in part because CEC really the organization really kind of pushed them for dissemination. So I think that's kind of the next stage is trying to get these things, if not embedded into guidelines and policy documents, at least trying to influence some journal editors to kind of incorporate some of these processes into their editorial sort of pipeline and process. So that's kind of where we're going next. In fact, I'm just going to give a little plug here. There's an upcoming conference. It's called the ABAI Single Case Conference. If you're a member of ABAI, if you're going to their conferences, you're probably getting emails about it. Yeah, it's September 26th through 28th in Minneapolis. And I think one purpose of this conference is to try to bring folks together in kind of more of, as opposed to sort of like the traditional, like, you go to like a presentation and you listen, like this is going to be a more interactive format. But Tim Slocum is presenting on questionable improved research practices. Jason and Travers and I will be presenting on replication. But we hope to use this as an opportunity, and we've got, a lot of journal reviewers and some journal editors there too. And we're hoping that this will kind of help us to push this forward at least in terms of editorial stuff, hopefully.
I mean, it definitely,
that's exciting.
Yeah, it definitely takes that sort of tack of needing to accelerate. The more people who know about it, the more people who are using it, the more it becomes an expectation, the more you could potentially have that generation of researcher students who are, well, this is just how you do the research. This is why. I don't even know why we do it that way anymore. It's in the way gone past. Somebody said we have to do it this way.
Right, right.
Would probably be ideal someday.
Yeah,
someday.
Yeah, for sure.
They look at the old scrolls of ABA research, and then there it is.
Yeah. We also have a paper. We actually have a second paper that's a survey. Like, we took the QRPs and IRPs that we came up with, and then we gave them to a larger group of single case researchers, and we asked them to rate how problematic and how frequently each QRP was occurring, or how problematic they were and how frequently they were occurring. And then for each IRP, we asked them how valid and feasible the IRP was. So that paper should hopefully be coming out in the near future.
Excellent. So still more to come on Corp-ERP results.
Corps and ERPs.
Corps and ERP. We got Corps, we got ERPs.
Sounds
coming
like
up with more solutions.
Guys, let's go ERPs.
So Dr. Matt Tincani, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you so much for looking into this area with your colleagues and publishing so much about it in just very easy to read and understand formats as well.
Thank you.
Continue to follow up. If folks do want to email to either ask about things that are on the table or to sort of discuss this, discuss this more at length, would it be okay if they reached out to you?
Yeah, sure. Yep. Tincani@temple.edu.
Excellent. Well, thank you again so much for talking with us about this.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on. It's been great.
Once again, we want to thank Dr. Matt Tincani for being on the show, but we have a little bit of wrap up to do with the last segment, pairings. Diana, take it away.
All right, it's time for pairings. Pairings is the part of the show where I tell you about past episodes we have in our now extensive library that you might want to check out if you enjoyed this one. You could certainly refer back to episode 111, where we talked about visual analysis of data. You could also check out the back-to-back episodes 172 and 173, which were practice to research and research to practice. And episode 271, where we talked about applied research practices with Dr. Malika Pritchett.
And if you want to hear an episode where we apparently mangled poor Dr. Tincani's name.
Oh, yeah.
Episode 3, social stories. We didn't
know how to pronounce it and pronounced it multiple ways.
Did we say Tincani?
And then talked about how it sounds like. Yes. Anyway.
But Matt was very.
But Tincani is correct. But he made sure to let us know first thing that.
Took it with stride. So we joked. It was right before you came on, Jackie. We were joking around a little.
Yeah, and I'll also note that we also reviewed some of his research in episode 220 on facilitated communication as well. He's got a lot of research, so that's not surprising.
So much.
And then I also recommend a snack to go with our pairings. And our snack today is Grandma's Secret Spaghetti Sauce, as I referenced earlier in the episode. You could probably eat that with noodles or meatballs, as you like.
It's Prince Spaghetti Day.
I think that is a regional reference that I don't get either. So.
I don't get it either.
The classic commercial. I'm sure
I think it was only in New England. So.
Yeah, I didn't get it either, Rob.
I don't think that's true. I'll look it up later. I'll let you know. I'll let you know in the preview. All right. So thank you all so much for listening. Thanks again to Dr. Matt Tincani for being on the show. We want to remind everyone that if you have not, please do subscribe to ABA Inside Track on your podcast player of choice, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you like to go. If you could leave us a review with your thoughts, or you can email those directly to us at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. We would really appreciate that. If you want to get access to all of the articles that we discussed, or at least links to all of the articles we discussed, as well as all of the articles we mentioned in pairings, you can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com. If you want even more ABA Inside Track content, you can head on over to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track to sign up at any level. But if you sign up at the $5 level, you'll gain access to our listener choice quarterly episodes right away with a video component as well as a free CE. If you subscribe at the $10 level, you'll be able to access all of our book clubs the moment they come out, as well as get their corresponding CEs for no additional charge. That also gets you access to everything a week ahead of time, discounts in the main CE store, and just a big old smile on my face when I see new names on our Patreon page. So again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. I guess that's a benefit for me rather than you. But, you can feel good knowing that you made me feel happy that I saw your name and saw that you were like, I like this, and left a comment. I appreciate it. Thank you. Oh, and some final thanks. Speaking of thanks, big thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro, outro music, Kyle Shuri for interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. And we can't forget your last secret code word. It's radiator, RADIATOR. It's that contraption that produces heat, or it's the first part of where Lightning McQueen and his friends live in the town of Radiator Springs, however you want to think about it. And with that, we'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.